So Dr. Nick Morgan is one of America's top communication theorists and coaches. A passionate teacher, he is committed to helping people find clarity in their thinking and ideas, and then delivering them with panache. He has been commissioned by Fortune 50 companies to write for many CEOs and presidents. He has coached people to give congressional testimony, to deliver TED Talks, and to take on the investment community. He has worked widely with political and educational leaders, and he has helped design conferences and prepare keynote speeches around the world. Nick's methods, which are well known for challenging conventional thinking, have been published worldwide. His acclaimed book on public speaking, Working the Room: How to Move People to Action Through Audience-Centered Speaking, was published by Harvard in 2003 and reprinted in paperback in 2005 as Give Your Speech, Change the World: How to Move Your Audience to Action. His latest book, Can You Hear Me?, was published by Harvard in 2018. He has co-authored several other books and hundreds of articles for local and national publications. Nick served as editor of the Harvard Management Communication Letter from 1998 to 2003. Nick is also a former fellow at the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Currently, he teaches mid-career executives in the Harvard Division of Continuing Education. After earning his PhD in literature and rhetoric, Nick spent a number of years teaching Shakespeare and public speaking at the University of Virginia, Lehigh University, and Princeton University. He first started writing speeches for Virginia Governor Charles S. Robb, and went on to found his own communications consulting company, Public Words, Inc., in 1997. Please welcome Dr. Nick Morgan. Thank you, Dr. Nick.
Thank you, Anastasia. Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the chance to hear all the introductions, and especially the bad jokes, because I know the kind of level I'm working with here. So that's very helpful. I feel at home. Thanks for that. So I'm going to talk about three things around Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, the context, just a tiny bit about the context, something of the structure of the speech, because that's a big part of its power, and then finally something of Martin Luther King's technique. And I heard somebody say that put yourselves on mute until the end, and you can ask questions. I'm very happy to take questions as we go. Fond as I am of the sound of my own voice, I like to hear other people speak too. So if you have a question, let's feel free to chime in. And Anastasia, I tend to get deep into my topic, and so if you notice in the chat that somebody's asking a question, can you just hello and yeah, wave me down, flag me down on the highway there, get me off the speed lane. Good. I think that's all the necessary preliminaries. The context of the I Have a Dream speech is fascinating to me, because we know it now at the end of an arc of Martin Luther King's life, of course, and how it ended so tragically. And he's been canonized as a saint of the civil rights movement, and as one of our American saints in essence. And so it's useful to go back and realize that at the time, history, while it assumes a sort of inevitability in retrospect, at the time it's always contingent, and it feels contingent to the people living it. It doesn't feel like the outcome is guaranteed. And that was certainly the case for the speech and for the March on Washington. There were ongoing negotiations as to whether the speech would be allowed to take place at all with the Kennedy administration, because there was such a fear of violence. And Martin Luther King had to constantly promise and repromise that he was sincere about his nonviolence, and he also had to answer to the people in the movement who were saying, Martin, you're not going far enough, and you're not violent. You should be violent. So that in that context, the speech assumes some importance that it doesn't really have for us as powerfully today, in that he was reaffirming the nonviolence of the movement, and as well bringing hope, or trying to bring hope and courage and steadfastness to the people that he was speaking to, the 300,000 or so folks on the mall. And the other bit of contingency that's kind of fun to remember is that I don't know how many public speeches you're capable of hearing in one day, but this came at the end of a very long, very hot day for people who had been on a march for some time. So the challenge for the speaker, for Martin Luther King, was to energize the audience that had already heard a lot of speeches and make them feel the passion of the moment again. So it's 28th August 1963, and when Martin Luther King takes the stage, he's got a couple of things in mind. The first is he's been up almost the entire night before writing this speech with his speechwriter, Clarence Jones. And as a speechwriter myself, I want to take a moment to give a tip of the hat to Clarence Jones, the great unsung contributor to the speech. There's a wonderful book by Clarence and a writing partner, Behind the Dream, which tells the story of this speech. And there are a number of sort of oral histories and kind of competing narratives about the speech, and I'm relying on this book as the authority for some of the things I'll say. A speech is a tough way to take in information. Audiences from long-time research typically remember something like 10 to 30% of what they hear. And if you're trying to make a speech memorable, then the question becomes, how do you do that? The wisdom nowadays is to tell stories. And there's a lot of good neuroscience behind that. I tell people to tell stories. In fact, one client of mine said, Nick, I get what you're about. Your one message, you can sum all the work up you do into one sentence, which is always be storytelling. ABS, which I thought was a braking system, but apparently now is, in his mind at least, was the theme for how I work. So I'll always be telling stories. In Martin Luther King's day, and the time of the speech, that was not the fashion. And so you'll note in the speech, there aren't stories per se. There's not personal testimony per se. The way to begin a speech nowadays typically is to talk about your own troubled past or the tragic conditions that have led you to where you are today. Martin Luther King did not do that. The rhetoric was more public and more circumspect. And so what you have at your disposal, in essence, is two things. You have various rhetorical techniques, and then you have the delivery itself, the techniques of delivery, body language, if you will, the way in which you speak and say and gesture. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about both. The two main techniques, rhetorical techniques, that MLK uses in this speech are, first of all, biblical quotations and quotations from songs, the common parlance of the day, and second, repetition. And it is the repetition, I will submit to you, by which we really know the speech today. The phrase, I have a dream, is repeated 9 times in the speech. And here's your first trivia question. As I teach this speech, I often ask the class these kind of questions. What's the phrase that's repeated one more time than that in this speech? We don't remember the speech as anything but the I have a dream speech. But in fact, he repeated one phrase one more time than that. So it should be known as the fill in the blank speech. We'll get to that. See if you can figure that out before I get there. So the essence of the speech, the structure of the speech is repetition, is based around repetition, except for the beginning, which was the part that Clarence Jones and MLK worked on so hard the night before, and I'll get into that in a second. The tradition of Baptist preaching was what lent the music to the second half of the speech and all that repetition. And that is the idea that you put a phrase out there like "I have a dream," and then you talk about some aspect of it, and then you repeat the phrase, and then you talk about that, and then you repeat the phrase. And that kind of repetition, then if you're doing it well, the phrase gathers magic, it gathers emotional weight, it gathers power as you repeat it. And that's certainly what happened in the case of the "I have a dream" phrase, not so much the other ones. And that's why we remember it today as the "I have a dream" speech. So I'll walk you through the structure. But the first thing to understand is that these phrases get repeated over and over again, and that is the essence of the speech. And why do I say the second half of the speech? Because the truly remarkable thing about this speech, generally considered one of the three best speeches of the 20th century by people like me when we get together and argue about what the best speeches are, "I have a dream" always comes up. The truly remarkable thing about it is that while Clarence Jones and MLK did stay up all night writing the speech, the last 6 minutes of this roughly 16, 17-minute speech was ad-libbed. And that's what makes it really amazing. And what happened was, apparently, as far as we know, Martin Luther King felt that the speech wasn't landing. Again, remember the contingency of the moment. It was a long, hot day. There had been many speeches beforehand. And he felt he wasn't getting the reaction from the audience that he needed to. So he departed from his text and started ad-libbing. He had been working on the idea of the "I have a dream," the phrase, before. He'd given it pieces of it and sections of it in a couple of speeches previously, but this was the first time it got full treatment. And as we know, it worked brilliantly. But to claim, or to make the claim that you have given one of the three best speeches of the 20th century is remarkable enough. But to say you ad-libbed the last third or almost half of it makes it truly extraordinary. So we'll look into how that works. I do, when I'm teaching the text and the speech, I do like to play the video. However, I'm not going to try to do that on Zoom because that often gets clunky, just with the sound and the lag in the between the voice and the picture and the voice. So I urge you to listen to the speech. Some of the things, if you haven't recently, some of the things I'm going to refer to have to do with things like tone of voice, and so it's very helpful to go back and actually listen to the speech. But let's get into the structure for a minute. And so the initial idea that Clarence and MLK worked on was this idea of a promissory note that Black Americans have been promised freedom, and as he says, it is obvious today, 1963, that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as their citizens of color are concerned. America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. Now, this reads pretty well, but it's a fairly heady concept. And the first trouble that MLK got into is that this metaphor just was a little too complicated, a little too intellectual to land for 300,000 people in a open air speech. And as he plays out the metaphor, we refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in this great vaults of opportunity, this nation. And so we've come to cash this check. It all gets a little diffuse and a little heady. It's not the greatest oral metaphor. It works better in print. And you see the idea of the repetition has started right at the beginning, but I just ask you to look at that repetition and see whether it's effective or not, as he says right at the start. But 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is sadly crippled. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. So it's great rhetoric, and the repetition helps us get the point orally, but the audience is not responding particularly. You can ask yourselves why. It matters where you put the repetition in a phrase in order to get the audience really to respond. And if you put it at the beginning of a sentence, as he does here, then the audience doesn't know what's coming next. And so they can't embrace the repetition as powerfully if you put it at the end of a sentence. So that's a simple trick there. If you really want your repetition to hit home, it needs to come at the end of the sentence. And then you see, after using and moving on from the promissory note and the whole sort of financial aspect of the metaphor for the speech. And I guess there are a number of accountants in this club, so you would particularly enjoy that when you go back and listen. The idea of the promissory note, that actually means something to you. So had he had an audience full of accountants, then it might have gone over better. The next set of repetitions is now is the time. And one of the things about speaking is it's always a matter of the moment. Speech, when it's given for the first time, is always embedded and needs to be embedded clearly in the moment. And what he's doing here is saying, in effect, that is the case. Now is the time to redeem the bad check. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice. This is good stuff. But again, the now is the time phrase is coming at the beginning of the sentence, so it doesn't land as powerfully. And the Reverend King keeps talking about this idea of being in the moment, the urgency of the moment. And here is the paragraph that the Kennedy administration insisted upon as they were negotiating beforehand to reassure an anxious world that Martin Luther King was still committed to nonviolence. And he says, there is something I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. This was aimed at the FBI agents in the audience listening and the Kennedy administration. In the process, let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. And he gets some applause then. I put in the applause marks, by the way. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. And here's the key sentence. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. So that was the hidden message to the Kennedy administration that was negotiated in advance about the speech, for the speech, to get permission to give it. So that, I hope, gives you some sense of the contingency of it.
Hey, Nick, Betty does have a question that might be good to answer now before we move further, because it's tied into this particular space. So Betty, do you want to just real quickly voice it?
If you could go back to the sentence about now is the time and then the quicksand, those two sentences from to lift our nation, how would you change it to put now is the time at the end to make it more impactful?
Yeah, good question. You'll see when we get to the I Have a Dream how you do that. So I'll answer that more fully then.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, right. So let's hang on to that. Good. And so he makes his pledge for nonviolence, and then he answers the implicit critics who are saying, basically back in the day, remember the contingency again, you're lucky to be getting the miserable shards of progress that we're handing out to you now, right? Why aren't you satisfied? And he says, we can never be satisfied. And this is a great set of repetitions here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times he repeats a phrase or variant of that we can never be satisfied. As long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging, as the basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. These are great themes here. This is very powerful stuff. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity, on and on. But that's not what gets the applause. What gets the applause is the quote, when justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. So that's echoing biblical phrasing, and that brings out the applause. And that's the point at which, right here, where I've marked it with applause, that the good Reverend decides that it's time to start ad-libbing. So you can see this. Unfortunately, the videos of the speech itself are taken by people who have experience in television and whatnot. And so for teachers of public speaking like me, it's enormously frustrating, because all I wanted was the camera to be kept on Martin Luther King the entire time, so I could see his face and see his hand gestures and see what he was doing, how he was interacting with the text. But of course, the folks with the cameras keep cutting away to the audience and reaction shots, because they know that makes for good video. And so you half the time, more than half the time, you can't actually see what Martin Luther King is doing. However, there is just enough of a clip to see here that from the paragraphs above, he's been looking down, reading, looking. You can see the regular motion down to the text, and it stops here. So that's one of the key ways we know that he was ad-libbing. And he directly addresses the audience, really, for the first time. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations, from narrow jail cells and so on. And he starts calling out the places that he knows they're from. Go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to South Carolina, to Georgia, to Louisiana, go back. And again, this repetition is useful for the audience, and the calling out of the place names is useful for the audience, but it's not deeply memorable. Doesn't get the applause until he says, "Let us not wallow in the valley of despair, I say to you today, my friends." Again, a quote from the Bible or Pilgrim's Progress, but a very biblical phrase. And so far, that's what's been getting the applause. So here we come to the great moment, and the first recorded use that we have of the "I have a dream" phrase, although, as I say, he apparently used it in speeches up to 6 months before, a little bit. And so he says, even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream, as a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. And then he goes on to repeat the "I have a dream" 9 more times. And you see here that it's at the beginning of the phrase. However, the way he speaks it, he typically tags the "I have a dream" that looks like it's at the beginning of the phrase onto the end of the one before it, to allow the audience to respond to that phrase. And then finally, in his ad lib, he gets to the point of "I have a dream today," and that's when the audience goes really wild for the first time. And so the phrase coming at the end of the sentence, that's how you do it, even if you put it at the beginning. So he says, "I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream." Big pause. He gets applause there. "That my 4 little children will one day." So if you listen to it, you'll see that what he's doing is tacking the "I have a dream" phrase that appears to be at the beginning of each sentence onto the one before it, and allowing the audience, therefore, to respond to the phrase, which is gathering power and resonance as he repeats it. And then picking picking up on the audience cues, then he says, "I have a dream today," to get his biggest round of applause, and repeats that again. And just a shout out to any speaker who can ad lib words like interposition and nullification. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. Nice job. That's all I can say. One day, right there in Alabama, little black boys and little black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. And that's the culmination. That's the "I have a dream" moment, because that's when he gets the most sustained and prolonged applause. That's the really the highlight of the speech. Now, he goes on then to repeat two other phrases. And there is a question, and I asked it at the beginning, what's the phrase that he repeats more often than even "I have a dream"? It's not the next one, "with this faith." He picks that one up. Again, remember, this is ad-libbing. He picks that one up and abandons it after only 3 repetitions, simply because most likely it's just hard to say. It's not that musical a phrase. "With this faith," the TH sounds a bit of a mouthful, so it doesn't roll off the tongue the way he would have liked it to. And so he lets that go and refers to "My Country 'Tis of Thee," the song. And that's the way he sets up the next bit, "Let freedom ring," which is a phrase from the song. And then he repeats that 10 times more than the "I have a dream." And yet this isn't known as the "Let freedom ring" speech. And so my question to you, or my next question to you, is why isn't this the "Let freedom ring" speech? It comes later in the speech. Arguably, it's as good a phrase, "Let freedom ring." It's a very American phrase. We're all about freedom in this country. Why don't we know this as the "Let freedom ring" speech? And the answer is to be found in the way in which he said the phrase, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but I just want to let you ponder that for a minute and see if you can figure it out. And the even more evidence, or even more voting for "Let freedom ring" as the powerful phrase, he connects them with a shout out to all the various locales around the U.S. he gets audience response, from each of those areas, shout outs from the folks from New Hampshire and New York and the Alleghenies of Pennsylvania as he goes around. And you'd think that would also add to the excitement of the phrase "Let freedom ring," because there's no better way to get an audience going than to do shout outs to members of the audience, locales from the audience. Anybody here from Dubuque is the classic cliche. So he starts with calling out the states: New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania, Colorado, California. And then he calls out, and he gets a good response, but then he calls out a couple of places that have particular civil rights significance, as you know from your history: Stone Mountain of Georgia, Lookout Mountain of Tennessee, and of course every hill and molehill of Mississippi. And that's when the audience really starts cheering. But they're not cheering the phrase "Let freedom ring." They're cheering the locales because they have enormous resonance. Whereas if you go back and listen to the "I have a dream" part, they're cheering the "I have a dream" phrase because it's so magical. But that's the second half of my question. Why don't we resonate with that phrase "Let freedom ring" as much? And then there's one last bit of repetition from the words, as he says, of the old Negro spiritual: "Free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last." And that gets the biggest roar of all. The audience knows they're home. They know that Martin Luther King's speech is going to be the final one of the day. And so this is a Miller time at this point. The audience goes wild. It's also a magnificent phrase to end on: "Free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last." And so the speech concludes with one more bit of repetition. All right. So let's talk. Well, let me pause there just for a second and see, Anastasia, if there are any other
Nick, I have a question,
any
if
other
I might.
questions. Yes, sir.
First of all, before I ask the question, I will tell you about our connection. I'm a proud Cavalier. I graduated from Mr. Jefferson's University, and I majored in rhetoric and persuasion. So we have a little commonality there.
Wahoo wah.
My wahoo wah is right. My recollection is there was a female on the stage, and I can't remember, was maybe Maya Angelou or Mahalia Jackson, that started encouraging him to tell about the dream. And so, and you didn't mention that at all, but I think, wasn't that the point where this person kicked him into high gear and got him really on a roll?
It was Mahalia Jackson, yes, and she had sung a song before that, and she stayed on stage, and it's a little uncertain. That I'll just say that it appears from the video that she says that, but the quality of the video, of course, because it's tied to his mic, and she's standing 10 feet or so behind, and the result is a little hard to make it out. But what everybody thinks she says is, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." And so that may have been in the moment, the inspiration for him to start doing that. As we say, people first figured that out. They gave her credit for sort of planting the idea in his head, but he had been talking the "I have a dream" phrase in speeches before that. So either she said it and that reminded him or inspired him to do it in the moment, or she didn't. We can't be entirely sure, and he was just inspired. So yeah, good question. But you're right, it was Mahalia Jackson.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions before Anastasia, before we get on to the technique?
No, I think those are the main questions for now. And if it's okay, we'll just keep the recording rolling and let you kind of wrap this part up, and then we'll blend in questions as we go along. So this is amazing. Someone did ask if there's a way that we can get this breakdown. So if there's a way that you can share that with us, then we can people can see it on their end after the fact.
Okay. So. Yeah, I wrote about it in one of my books, but so I can put the link for that. But
okay.
If you mean
well, that, but I'm thinking also just like what we're looking at right now, if there's a way to share that. I think let's see, who was it that asked that?
The text.
Oh, Randall, yeah. Can you post
the speech?
Print it? Yeah.
Oh,
I don't know if
that just comes. I mean, that just comes from the American Rhetoric website. So
yeah, okay.
Anyway.
I'm sure we can find that, Randall, and get that dropped in somewhere.
I'm a little nervous because the King family is they're really tigerish in maintaining the copyrights and the rights to Martin Luther King's speech. So I don't want to run afoul of them in putting anything out
that's understandable.
Legally allowed to. Yeah. All right. So you have now a good sense of what the structure of the speech was. The first half written out and based or formed around the promissory note idea. The second half ad-libbed and basically structured by introducing a phrase, talking about it, repeating the phrase, talking about it, repeating the phrase, which comes from that technique comes from Baptist preaching, particularly, but many traditions use that kind of repetition as a form of public speaking. So it's a familiar rhetorical technique. In terms of his delivery, there are a number of things that are essential to understand, and we'll also answer the question that I posed earlier about why is "I Have a Dream" so magical. In talking about this, the first technique that he uses, though, that we need to understand, and this is a sin that his avoidance of it, let's say, is a sin that's repeatedly committed by clients and people that I work with and people that I coach. And so it's sort of a lifelong cause here and to try to make the speaking world better. Martin Luther King does this beautifully, so take a lesson from Martin. But the idea is that he understands how to pace a speech to wait for the audience to respond. The phrase is, let your points land. And many of us are brought up to be nervous about silence in public speaking. We think we have to fill all the noise. We use filler words when we can't think of a word to say. We use ums and ahs. And the letting something land and giving a moment of silence for it to land and then for the audience to absorb it and respond is a powerful technique, one of the most powerful speaking techniques to make your own speaking better. And it involves not doing something as well as rather than doing something. So it's arguably an easy one to learn, but you do have to get over your insecurity about leaving silent space. But Martin Luther King, has from many years as a preacher, understood this very well and understood this sort of call and response format. So that's the first thing to note, is his pacing is magnificent. He allows time for his words, literally as sound waves, to get out to 300,000 people and come back to him in the form of applause. And he knows not to talk over himself or the audience response. The second thing that he's doing, and there's some really interesting studies now, we didn't know it at the time, but neuroscience is letting us in on a sort of secret here about Martin Luther King's voice, which is that it's very resonant. And resonance, it turns out, is a quality that we can measure. And there was a study recently done of technology company CEOs in speaking to their boards. And it found that the CEOs with more resonance in their voice got paid on average 6% more over the lifetime of their tenure as CEO than those who didn't have resonant voices. Now, the accountants on this call will tell you that 6% of a huge sum of money is quite a bit over a 10 or a 20-year career. So it matters. What is resonance? Resonance is difficult to describe, but easy to hear, in the sense that it's the right mixture of sort of nasal vocal production and chest vocal production, or sort of more sonorous vocal production. It's a sort of the blend of those two things. And voices that are too nasal sound like this. If the voice goes up into the nose, then it sounds like this, and as a result, it carries further. That's the good thing about a nasal voice. But the bad thing about it is you can't stand to listen to it for very long. You're going to put me on mute if I keep talking like this. And if my voice is too deep and resonant and too boomy, then it can get actually hard to understand over a microphone or over a audio system. So the voice needs to blend between the two. Martin Luther King has the perfect resonance. I don't know whether he got 6% more than his fellow preachers I don't think that's been studied over his speaking career as a preacher, but as I say, the CEOs certainly do. So resonance is something, and more seriously than the financial rewards for it. If you think about the human voice, when we speak to each other, the truly extraordinary thing that's going on with the voice is that every single voice is unique, and you all have the ability to recognize literally hundreds of voices without even a half a second's thought. And that ability is undertaken by your unconscious mind, and it does an instant analysis, and you can tell, therefore, your mother's voice from a good friend's voice, from your spouse's voice without having to think about it consciously. You don't go, I hear an interesting bit of soprano or tenor or bass voice, and that person sounds an awful lot like my mother. Let me think about it. Yep, that's my mom. You don't do that. You just instantly know who that is. And another fun fact, somebody was citing a trivia book earlier on this call. Another fun fact is that it turns out apparently that fingerprints repeat about approximately once every billion humans. And so there are a few people out there with your fingerprints. So if you try to, or if they try to commit a crime, you may be in trouble if we're still being identified by our fingerprints. However, as far as we know, and there's 7 or 8 billion people on the planet now, voices are unique. And if you pose that as a question, or if you ask yourself the puzzle, why would humanity evolve to have completely unique voices? That is something, and how would we do that? That is something that's kind of extraordinary, because we put a lot of energy into creating these unique voices. So why is that so important? We don't know the answer to that. Presumably it's to be able to identify yourself in the dark in the cave before there was electric lighting, but we don't really know the answer to that. And the way in which it works is perhaps even more extraordinary. So if you speak at a pitch. You could imagine somebody finding the note on the piano that I'm roughly intoning right now. But that's only the beginning of the voice. Above and below that pitch, there are what are called overtones and undertones. And they have an extraordinary range. So if you know anything about sound, you know that it's measured in terms of hertz or cycles per second. The overtones go up to 20,000 hertz. So a note might be 300 hertz or something like that. There's an extraordinary stacking of overtones, echoes, if you will, of that original note above, going all the way up to 20,000 hertz, and then down to practically 0, 11 or 12 hertz below it. And it's the emotions. The extraordinary thing is the emotions are carried in the undertones and overtones. So that's really the purpose, if you will, of undertones and overtones. But that whole array of overtones and undertones over the course of 20,000 hertz, from 0 almost to 20,000 hertz, is what gives each voice its unique fingerprint, if you will. And so all of that adds up to the resonance or lack thereof in a voice and its unique quality. The other thing that Martin Luther King is doing, and here's really the answer to the question that I asked about why is the "I have a dream" phrase the one that stuck, and he's doing something that we call in the business the authoritative arc. And this is your quick and easy takeaway for the day to improve your own speaking. There's and I didn't hear many of you doing this, but there's a terrible disease in society today where people say things as if they were questions. Their voices go up at the end of phrases. If you have colleagues who do this, I know it drives you absolutely crazy, as it does me. You're now begging for me to stop. Yes.
Yes. Just add some vocal fry in there too.
Yeah. Then you'll be truly
Yeah,
driven insane.
then you're sounding like a 20-something, co-ed.
Exactly. Yeah. So this used to be called Valley Girl speak. So welcome, California, or you're welcome, California. But it's now so widespread that we don't call it Valley speak anymore, but saying everything as if it were a question presumably comes from the urge to get agreement. So if we're in a collegial group in our workplace, for example, what we do is we say things rather than stating them as declarative sentences. Then if we say them as phrases, then our poor audience is compelled to go, yes, and reassure us constantly. Well, I'm sure for you, it's as irritating as it is for me. Martin Luther King did exactly the opposite. So he says, "I have a dream," and his voice comes down. So it goes up at the beginning of the phrase to show passion and energy and commitment and it comes down at the end to show authority. That's what we call it, the authoritative arc. And so you're on, if you were talking earlier about Southwest and various airlines, I challenge you to go up to the desk and ask the person for an upgrade. And if you say this in the way, if you say, can I have an upgrade? The answer is going to be no, because you're just asking a question easy to say no to. But if you say, could I have an upgrade, please? And let your voice come down subtly at the end, it'll increase by approximately 42% the chances of you getting an upgrade. And I just made that number up, but it's worth a try. So go try it. The point here is that Martin Luther King makes that phrase memorable. I have a dream, by that arc of music in his voice. If he had said, I have a dream, we wouldn't remember this as the I have a dream speech if his voice had stayed up at the end. But because it comes down at the end, then he's saying it with authority. So he gets both passion and authority in that phrase, and we remember the phrase. The reason Let Freedom Ring didn't work so well is it's simply harder to say that as a authoritative arc. With the dream, the sound, you've got that nice open E and then an M at the end. So you can close off on that. I have a dream is a good word to end on. Let freedom ring kind of hangs out there. And so just technically, it doesn't work as well as a repeated phrase, especially one that's trying to get applause, to try to get a reaction from. And so I'm sure he wasn't thinking about that as he was giving the speech. I'm absolutely sure. But it might have unconsciously been in his mind that, boy, that sounds like a good phrase. Or he had tried it out, as we said, a couple of times in previous speeches and found that it worked. But I have a dream is the perfect phrase for that kind of authoritative resonance and power, and therefore memorable phrasing. And so that's, I submit to you, Golden Gate Breakfast Club, that is the reason why we remember this as the I have a dream, as the I have a dream speech. And I'll just make one other, and then I'll be happy to stop for any other questions people have. I'll just make one other comment about the body language of the speech. We can't see much of it, unfortunately, because the cameramen were not instructed by a speech coach just to focus on Martin Luther King the entire time. But we do see one thing, which is fun. At the end of the speech, when he says, free at last, we thank God Almighty, we are free at last. He raises his hand up like this. Bring it down a little so you can see my hand. He's putting it over his head like that. Now that is a gesture common from Baptist preaching. When you get to the end, when you're bringing it home, when it's time to say amen and wrap it up. And so it's a guaranteed crowd pleaser, because at church, the sermon is almost over. And it had the same effect on the audience at home. However, there's another trick or a bit of neuroscience involved in that, and here's your other free takeaway for the day. If you think about hand gestures, they can either be gestured, you can either gesture or think about it on a vertical axis or on a horizontal axis. So I can either move my hands this way or this way. And if I'm moving them this way, then I'm going from closed, which is this position in front of my hands, both hands in front of my torso, to open. And as a speaker, when you open yourself up like this, you create trust, you create a connection with the audience. If you do this, as many speakers do, because they're trying to protect themselves, they're feeling self-conscious standing in front of an audience, then what you say to the audience is, I'm a little nervous and you should be too. So that's the real message behind this gesture, whereas this open gesture says, you can trust me, it's all good. Now, on a vertical axis, you signal how important what you're saying is. And so if I'm standing like a soldier with my hands at my sides, that's minimal importance, minimal investment in what I'm saying. That's why a soldier stands at attention, to show he's not, or she is not, about to attack or move or do anything. You're ready, but you're not doing anything. Most of our conversation happens if we bring our hands to just, it's hard to show on this, screen. But if we bring our hands to just above the waist, we do most of our gesturing down there. And that's sort of conversational level of engagement. If I bring my hands up here, I say this is really important. And if I bring my hand up here where Martin Luther King did, I say, this is it. This is the final moment. Or if I'm Mick Jagger, I say it's time to party. If you ever have seen Mick Jagger in concert, you'll notice he gives almost the entire song, every single song, with his hands up here, fist pumping one way or another. So this is saying, woohoo, ecstasy, over the top emotion. Or if you're Martin Luther King, it's saying, this is it. This is the final moment of the speech. And so that's how you bring it home. Let your voice go in that authoritative arc, and then, if appropriate, raise your hand above your head and said, this is it. Tony Robbins, by the way, who's been an extraordinarily successful speaker, begins his speech and gives a lot of his speech with his hands up here, doing the same thing, saying this is over the top energy, power, and intensity. And so with that, I thank you for your attention. Be delighted to take any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. We have a note from Patricia. She's at an airport, so you can read that in the chat as to what she shared and how much she appreciated this. We have a lot of NSA members here, so they're totally jacked to be hearing this. Colin, I believe, had a hand up first, so I'm going to pass it off to him, and then Carl after that, and then anyone else who wants to pipe in.
Okay, so yeah, what really struck me was when you went into the voice and the timbre of voice, because as a voice actor, I have to manipulate my voice into various different ways and do various different things with it, and various different, so you get this, and because that's how you also identify the cartoon character, how, it's like when you see a particular cartoon character, and I'm shown a picture of a cartoon character, and then I have to come up with a voice for it, for that character. And so that really stuck out with me, in terms of, because voice actors, we have to manipulate the timbre of our voices in various different ways. And but yeah, King's voice was very unique in that way. It was almost like a French horn. It didn't have the stridency of a trombone, but it had this, that sort of open but heroic quality that a French horn has.
Nice. Yeah, I love that. And as a voice actor, you have the ability and the awareness to move your voice around. That's very hard for most people because they're not very aware of what their voice sounds like. So
and then it's like even doing something like a deadpan delivery, because sometimes some people if you want to play a character who's reading something, it's like, this is da 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 da, So, but yeah, being able to hear and mimic the various different voices and inflections is something that's part of that skill set. Yeah, King's voice is very unique like that.
Yeah, thanks. And you're aware then, as Colin just demonstrated, how immediate your emotional response is when he does move his voice around like that. You think you get a very different reaction to you feel a different personality right away, and that's just one indication of how important our voices are.
Yeah, it's a very big difference between very light, very soothing and comforting, and then Dr. Eggman, feel the power. So
Exactly.
Carl?
Yeah, two things that I've always felt about listening to and watching that speech, and to just jump on what you said about the way he says, I have a dream. He starts with, I have a dream, and then sort of morphs into, I have a dream, which puts it in the possessive. And so the response from the audience, like a Baptist service, is, I do too. That's why they respond so powerfully with it. And then the raising of the hand at the end, that's a preacher's blessing gesture. He's blessing the audience with that. And I think he did these things instinctively. I don't know, he didn't think about it. He was just used to doing it.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, great comment. Who
All right.
else?
Susan Rowan, you're muted. Unmute.
Okay, all right, my red mute matched my orange jacket. Anyway, as you explained the use of the hands and how we expand, when you did this and how he did the priestly blessing, which we have where they actually do the priestly blessing, it also explains the power of this.
Mhm.
The
Yes.
goose step and the Heil Hitler is
Yes.
how he did that. And that just struck me as, oh yeah, but it's significant. I thank you for this. You parsed it so very well. A different way to work a room than I talk about, but certainly standing in front of groups, his was magnificent. But I also know that sometimes the best speakers are the good sermonizers.
Mm.
And when we hear a good sermon, I was raised with a good sermonizer and some bad ones. I think we want to study good speech. I'm not forcing everyone to go to houses of worship, but they certainly are a brand unto themselves. And if I'm not mistaken, in many of the seminaries, they do teach what you're talking about to ministers, rabbis, priests, etc. That's just my thought. Thank you. It was illuminating.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. And yes, they do teach it. It's fascinating. Some seminaries, all seminaries teach the art of giving a sermon. They treat it in very different ways. Some of them deal with body language and some of them don't. And it's always extraordinary to me when somebody tries to teach the art of rhetoric without including body language, because as I always say, every communication is two conversations. On the one hand, it's the content. On the other hand, it's the body language. When those two are aligned, you can be effective. But when they're not aligned, the body language always trumps the content. And so a preacher who doesn't think about body language, or a speaker, is setting him or herself up for failure.
You know,
That's a
I'm
great
just going to
point.
say this because she is in an airport and doesn't want to unmute. Patricia Fripp has been hired to teach speaking techniques to people of the cloth,
Hmm.
because sometimes they don't connect because of what you said. And I will stop preaching.
Thank you.
Anastasia, you have a question, and then Betty, I think I saw raise her hand.
Yes, two things. So Fripp, as I said, she couldn't unmute at the airport, and now I think she's hopping on a plane. But she wanted to know if you are a fellow member of the Professional Speech Writers Association. And by the way, she's saying your praises. She just absolutely loved this and wanted to remind you that there's a lot of professional speakers in our group. So that was a question that she had. And then I have a question. I'd like to know, when you were talking about this being considered one of the top 3 speeches of all time, what are the other 2? And I understand that there's, of course, some leeway with that, but I would be curious to hear your thoughts on that. So if you can answer Patricia's question, we'll get that back to her, and then maybe answer my question after that.
Yes, I forget whether I'm paid up or not, but I am a member. And the other 2 speeches, it varies a little. One of them is certainly President Kennedy's inaugural address. That one always comes up. So those are the clear sort of top 2 winners. The third one often goes to Winston Churchill, and there we have an embarrassment of riches. There's the sunny uplands speech. There's the finest hours, but there are a variety of possible Churchillian moments, and then you open the floodgates, and there's so many others that you could start considering. So let's not fritter our time away debating that, but yeah, it's fun to think about.
I was thinking, I did think of JFK immediately. I was leaning more towards Abraham Lincoln. After
Well,
that,
I did
but
say the
Churchill,
20th.
yeah.
I said the 20th century. So
Oh,
Yeah.
there we go. Okay, got it.
All right, Betty, you had a question?
Yes, excellent presentation, Nick. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can you reiterate when you talk with your hands at your shoulder level, what that is significant about?
Yes, as you raise and lower your hands, you're stressing. The higher you raise your hands, the more important you're saying this, your message is. So if you start with your hands down sort of mid-thigh at rest, parade rest, then that's least emotional intensity or least importance. And as you raise your hands to waist level, then that's sort of normal conversational level. Up here, very important, like you got to get this.
Okay, got it.
If
Thank
you
you.
remember one thing, remember this. And then up here is, as we say, Mick Jagger,
Party.
Tony Robbins, and preachers bringing it home.
Thank you.
Cool. Any other questions? It's getting late and it's after 9. So if anybody, I've got to run and many are running now. So give our speaker, Nick, a great round of applause, everybody. Thank you so much,
you.
Nick. It was a